them away, raises them, and then they eventually become the rulers of the kingdom of Latinium. But they don't get along very well. So this is a Cain and Abel story. So Romulus kills his brother Remus, but the place where they were saved, where that tree was, they start their city there. And because Romulus is the only one left now, they call it Rome. So this is the core story of the Romans, of how they came to establish the city of Rome in the kingdom of Latinium. And to understand that, you have to appreciate that every year, on the day that Romulus and Remus were saved, they have their great celebration. Now, when was it? It was in the month of February. And let's see, let me write it up here. Now, in February, the day of the full moon was always the day they celebrate this event. And they would never forget to do this because this was so important to them and their sense of identity, that they are the new Troy. See, the thing people don't understand is Rome and all the history of Rome. The Romans didn't see it that way. The Romans saw themselves as Trojans. And so whoever were their enemies before were their enemies now. The Greeks, for example, why did they defeat the Greeks? Because they're Trojans. You see, it's this idea that they have a destiny, they have a mission, that they have to wreak revenge on all these people that caused them so much trouble over the years. Not the least of which was Carthage. And so, because Aeneas had spent a lot of time in Carthage and had a famous love affair with Dido, the queen, but they became mortal enemies when Aeneas left and more or less dumped Dido. And Dido was a beautiful queen, of course. And so the Romans were enemies with the Carthaginians, the Romans were enemies with the Greeks, the Phoenicians, anybody who had opposed Troy. And Troy had a lot of enemies, of course. And so that's the most important thing to understand. So this always happened on the full moon. Now remember, the Romans, as were the Jews, as were the Greeks, were on a lunar calendar. So every month they would have a group that would wait to see the first crescent of the month. And they would declare that was the first day of the month. So that the middle of the month was always going to be a full moon. So when is the middle of the month? Well, the full moon comes around the 14th. 29 and a half days in the moon cycle, but 3 of those are dark. So the full moon, which by the way is called what? Ides. So the full moon, the Ides, is going to be on the 14th. Now keep in mind what the 14th is for us. It's Valentine's Day. All right? No longer a full moon necessarily, although it could be every once in a while. Now, here's why they called it February. So at the Lupercalia celebration, they had all kinds of games. You know, the Romans just loved games. But the one game they particularly liked was this game where young men, about the ages of between 18 and 22, would be selected for their great running ability, and they would strip naked. And they had a job to do. They were to wear a skirt made of leather strips, but lots of leather strips all around. And these leather strips were not necessary to cover up their parts, their private parts. The Romans didn't care anything about that. In fact, as you know, all their games were naked. Remember when Alexander the Great wanted to get the armor of Achilles, which was buried with him. When they told him where the armor was, he stripped down and came to Troy. And he ran all the way to the burial site and then dug up the armor, naked. So the reason he was naked, because this was considered a holy thing he was doing. And they considered the games holy. In other words, we think of games are like very secular, right? Not for the Romans, not for the Greeks. They're very holy. And so being naked is to be in your natural form. And it's amazing how, in a lot of ways, we don't identify with any of that, although we come out of that culture, the Greek and Roman culture. For us, nakedness is kind of a thing of shame, right? And so anyway, they would wear these strips, which were called feber, strips of leather called feber. Now what they did is really weird, okay? So there'd be a gauntlet they'd have to run through. Only it's a gauntlet of young women. Women between the ages of, at the oldest maybe 40-something, and the youngest maybe 14. That's pretty big, yeah. But these are women who wanted to get pregnant. So the idea was, as the men ran by, these young men ran by, you grab a strip. Now, it wasn't necessarily easy to get a strip. And if you missed, you might have to chase a boy, but those boys were fast. And the girls might be fast runners, but they probably weren't necessarily as fast as these boys, because these were the fastest runners in the kingdom. And so they would grab. And so you get the picture of all these women grabbing at the boys, but there were limits. You know, they could only come so close, and they would try to grab one of those strips. If they got the leather strip, then they would take that leather strip, and that would be with them whenever they were in bed sleeping. They always had it with them, and that was a little talisman, a little magical thing that would bring them pregnancy and bring them children. So it is on the one hand, from their point of view, kind of a practical thing, but it was also a challenge, right? A game, right? And where the game was, can the girls get the strips? And I was giving this talk one time, and one of the ladies said, "That's the most incredible thing I've ever heard of. Boys running away from beautiful girls." And I thought that's very true, because that's not something they would normally do. All right, now we come back now to this idea of Rome and what the Romans were then up to. So they justify conquering the world as they knew it by the fact that they are just reestablishing Troy, and they are establishing the Trojan tradition. So they send, for example, people out on places to establish new kind of one of the most famous people that was ever sent was Brutus, who was another grandson of Aeneas. See if you can figure out where they sent him. England. That's why England's called Britain. The Britons. Rule Britannia. I'm reading a book right now. You'd be interested, Jimmy, if you haven't read this one yet. It's called How the Scots Invented the Modern World. Have you seen it?
No.
Now, I had always thought the Encyclopedia Britannica would come from London, English, but no, it was created in Edinburgh by Scots, and is the longest continuing production in the world except for the Bible. In other words, it's never been out of print. In fact, today it's bigger than ever. It just expands endlessly. Knowledge, all digital, all online, and that kind of thing. But, or the song, Rule Britannia, Britannia Rule the Sea, the Scottish. And there's on and on and on about how the Scots were so influential in economics and law, political theory, you name it, philosophy. And not to mention the influence of Calvin through John Knox and the Calvinists that all came to America and all of that. Now, I want to mention in that context that the Scots ultimately decided that they were better off as Englishmen, and actually they've been much better off as Englishmen. Back in the 1740s, they decided they wanted to be part of England, and they had to vote on it. Now what did we hear on the news? The Scots are going to vote yet again. They just voted about separating from England. Now they're going to vote again, and this sort of goes on endlessly. The Scots can never quite decide who they are. See, so the idea of Britannia, the idea that there's England, there's Wales, and there's Scotland, and then there's Ulster. You know what Ulster is? Northern Ireland. Ulster, very important. Ulster and the 10 northern counties, there's the Scotch-Irish. They call them Irish because they lived in Ireland, but they weren't Irish at all. They're Scottish. They're Presbyterians. And Scotch-Irish that came in such vast numbers to America. You know, all those guys like Stonewall Jackson, like Daniel Boone, Henry Clay, they all are Scotch-Irish, right? And they love their whiskey and so forth. But anyway, that those four quote-unquote countries unified in Britain, that Britain is something different than England. We tend to think England, Britain, same thing. Nuh-uh, not at all. And by the way, mostly today they call it UK, United Kingdom, meaning it's united, separate independent countries united together in one kingdom. That concept has worked for a long time, about almost 300 some years. So it's pretty important. How did we get off on that? Oh yeah, we're talking about so the Romans. Now the thing to understand about the Lupercalia is that when Christianity came in, the Romans, of all their festivals, were not going to give up the Lupercalia. No, we love that holiday. In fact, the one thing people really fight for is if a holiday is ever given to them, it's never taken back, that I know of, right? Outside of revolution. Napoleon did it, created new holidays because he had a clean slate after the French Revolution. But actually, most holidays, people will really get upset if you say, you're not going to get off Christmas. But Christmas is a Christian holiday. No, you still get off Christmas. In other words, even Walmart is closed on Christmas. That tells you how important. So think Christmas here, because Christmas is our big mega holiday, right? But Christmas is probably even small compared to what the Lupercalia was for the Romans. It was just this magnificent holiday. So they weren't going to give it up. So the Christians are very clever, the missionaries and the bishops at that time. They said, no, you keep this holiday. We're not going to change anything. It's February, it's full moon, your holiday. You got it. But we want to honor one particular saint. Who's that? Well, his name was Valentine. Why do you want to honor him? Well, this was his birthday. And he was a great man, and he was a great lover of lovers. Suppose he got in trouble because he married two Christians who, for a brief time in the Roman Empire, it was illegal for the Christians to marry. So he allowed them to get married. He married them, and then for this he was martyred, right? So the idea that St. Valentine's loved lovers. So we want to honor his, and you can keep calling it Lupercalia, the day of the what? but we're going to call it St. Valentine's Day. Well, Lupercalia was only important to the Romans, the people primarily then in Italy and in the other Roman provinces. But as it spread out, the St. Valentine's Day tag stuck. And so, to this day, St. Valentine's Day is remembered not for, strangely enough, for St. Valentine's at all. Have you ever gotten a Valentine's card that had a painting of St. Valentine's on it? Never. No, it's going to have the two things. It's going to have a heart on the front. You're going to open it up. There's going to be Cupid, and he's shooting an arrow, and it'll say, "Won't you be my Valentine?" Right? Valentine cards are the most predictable cards of all cards, right? "Won't you be my Valentine?" So, who is Cupid? Cupid is the son of Aphrodite, the goddess of fertility. You see, February is the month of fertility. It's the month of what they call the fever. Because surprisingly enough, they didn't think of love, romantic love, as a good thing. They thought of it, many of the Romans, as a disease. It was a disease that you had. You could get over it, but it was very difficult to get over. And it took a long time. And but if you gave into it, that wasn't a good thing. Except Aphrodite was the one goddess who is always promoting eros, right? Christianity is promoting agape, which is, the love, the purest kind of love, right? So agape and eros are a little bit in conflict here. So the day of eros is today still February 14th. February 14th, we buy the candy, we buy the flowers, we buy 2 cars, we buy clothes, you name it, right? In honor of eros. But what's important is that Valentine's Day, in my lifetime, has gotten to be a bigger deal, right? There are 2 holidays that have gotten to be much bigger in my lifetime. One of those is Valentine's Day, and the other is Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras was something they did down in New Orleans. Nobody else did it, but now you can go to your Tom Thumb and buy king cake, right? And Valentine's, it's kind of like the Super Bowl parties. It's just a little excuse to have another party, right? Have another get together. Now, I told you, and because our time runs out so fast, it just goes, I told you I would make the connection, this is for Barry, between Texas and the Romans, all right? And the connection, of course, is through the Lupercalia. Now, if you haven't heard this before, appreciate the fact that you have to have a little imagination to realize significance here. But about 150 years ago, the botanists were in the business of naming wildflowers and plants of all kinds, right? And they came to one particular wildflower that was a wildflower that had particular kind of unique quality. It was always the very first wildflower to come up. It was also a wildflower that would spread during the winter out to a territory and contain that territory. And the botanist who was naming the flowers said it reminded him of a wolf, because a wolf would stake out a territory, and in that territory would let no other animal. Well, this plant would let no other plant come until after that plant had come up, bloomed, the seed dropped, and then the other flowers, the other wildflowers just come like crazy, usually in April, May. Well, of course, that is from the word lupine. And of course, the most famous lupine in the world is the Texas lupine. So the conditions in Texas are absolutely ideal for the lupine. They are very mild winters, lots of rain comes just at that in the early spring. And depending on the year, last year we didn't have any winter, right? So I started seeing bluebonnets early in February. But typically the height of the bluebonnet season isn't until April. And I have never seen such a bluebonnet year as we had last year, because we had a mild, very, very mild winter and the rain. So we were down in the very, very beginning of April in Fredericksburg, Texas. And somebody said, go north on the state highway where line passes. Ladies and gentlemen, I've lived in Texas now almost 50 years. And I have never, and I've seen bluebonnets, I've enjoyed bluebonnets every year. I've gone on bluebonnet trail, but I had never seen anything like it. The bluebonnets were endless for 50, 60, 70 miles. Now, it was all started by the Texas Highway Department, went out on state highways and planted seeds. But the conditions were absolutely ideal. And we were there just at its moment of perfection. There is one other plant that the bluebonnet will allow. It's called an Indian paintbrush. So you'll see the paintbrushes mixed in with the bonnets, and it's just spectacular. Did you go, tell us your experience, Colin.
Oh yeah, we did a little slideshow that I showed during my Qigong classes and everything. It's unbelievable. We were especially going out to Enchanted Rock, just both sides of it. We got a little picture of an artist out there painting them. And we did the loop and all of those, and it was just amazing. But some of the places that they said had a lot of them, which was along a lake shore. I can't remember where that was, but down in that area, they weren't really out. But along that road that you said, oh,
Colin, I happened to be speaking somewhere, and Colin happened to be there and heard this, and then I think the next day or two.
Yeah, we went down.
You went down to see it. So that's impressive when you can paint a picture and then somebody said, well, I want to see that too. Yeah. But it was really worthwhile experience for everybody. All right, now I want to wrap this up in a couple of ways because we're out of time. One thing to remember about the Romans is that their primary contribution was in setting up the Roman Republic, which existed about half the Roman history is the Republic, and the other half is the Empire. But in the Republic, of course, the Senate chose the ruler, and the Senate were the representative of the people. Now, as with Athens, and we talked about this before, it's only the people that own property and have wealth that are involved in that. But still, it's still a group of people choosing a ruler rather than the ruler taken over by force, which is what happened in the Empire. So the Roman Republic became one of the primary models for the American state. And so this is extremely important contribution the Romans made to us. And then, but I would say most of their contributions in the area of what we call engineering and architecture and so on, they were phenomenal. And I had my epiphany. Jimmy and I often talk about epiphanies. I had my epiphany when I finally got to Rome and got to go into the Pantheon. Now, the Pantheon, which means the temple to all the gods, was built by the Romans kind of late in the Roman history. But because it was late, they had by that time perfected the use of concrete. Their cement was of the highest quality, probably better than ours. And they had perfected concrete and could build these massive structures with concrete rather than with stones, which is what they had done for most of Roman history.
Paul, about what year was that?
Well, this would be about 200 years after the time of Christ. So the Romans, fade from the scene about 450. But they're not gone because they transfer, as you know, to become the Byzantine Empire. But in Rome, in Italy, they were really gone by the late 400s. But so this is about 250 years before that. So it was one of the later buildings, but it was built of concrete. And I thought I was walking into a modern building. I mean, it's just incredible. When I stepped in, how everything was so well preserved. Luckily, they had maintained it as a church. And because it was a church, they kept up, you know, when the roof needed repair, they repaired it. So it's the one Roman building, there aren't any others like this, that you can see what the Romans did, what they were able to build. And because of concrete, there 2,000 years almost later, there it is. And that's why many of our buildings will be here 200, 400,000 years from now because they're made of concrete. And if they can be like this building, for example, if this building can be reutilized, it'll be here probably for a long, long time, until somebody wants property for something else, right? And so it's always hard to say how long a building will last, but in terms of its structural integrity, concrete will last a very, very long time. So the Romans were superb in this area, building aqueducts, bridges, roads, all of this stuff. And so in many ways, Americans are Romans. I would agree with that, with the caveat that we are Romans of the Republic. In other words, we believe in the idea that the representatives of the people will do the choosing of our laws, and then, you know, early in American history, the president was always chosen by the representatives and not direct vote. But then eventually it evolved to direct vote for the president and direct vote for the Senate. The senators, down to the turn of the 20th century, were not directly voted on by the states. Well, we run out, and I'm very sorry and apologize about that, but I always hate to leave, but I look forward to seeing you maybe in May and then again here next January. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Paul, I'd like to go on record and say I hope that the Americans have the guts to make the positive changes from this inauguration.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm gonna do the little piece here for Janet. What I did just before you came
Well,
in.
whatever positive changes.
Colin,
After school.
Colin,
Oh, I know, yeah.
we've already seen the positive change that happened yesterday.
Yeah. 600.
That's, when you see that type, and we've never seen that in American history,
That's right.
Amazing.
people are waking up,
Yep.
and we're gonna move beyond 50% voting to maybe 80% voting, and that will
Amazing.
change everything,
Yeah.
because the demographics don't support where we're going.
Which
So-
part of the change are you talking about? We saw yesterday.
Women power, women in the streets, women power,
That's also new.
women change the world. Don't piss
They
off a
always
goddess. Don't piss off a goddess.
They always have.
What I was pointing out,
Yeah, you got
is that
it.
people never think about what inauguration means. Inauguration means, in augur, this is the fortune teller. And the soothsayer, the person who has to look into the future to see if what you're doing is gonna work, if the stars are in alignment. And so the augur has to be consulted before you can have the event. So in augur means that you have the blessing of the augur, of the fortune teller, to proceed with the project, with the event. And so you would not have an inauguration, literally, without the augur, without the fortune teller being there and saying, yes, this is good, you can go ahead with this. So we probably needed a fortune teller on Friday, right? To tell us where this thing is gonna go. And anyway, we talked about this just briefly before you got here, because most people use this word without thinking about the implication of it. Yeah, go ahead.
Paul, you talked about the Valentine's Day being the most important day of the
Yeah,
Roman world.
yeah,
However, square that with Saturnalia, which was their huge festival in the winter time that was
Right.
2 weeks long.
yeah,
Wars would stop, all court cases would stop, there could be no adjudication for 2 weeks,
right,
complete stoppage of everything, celebrating the return of the lights. And that was the one when the Romans adopted Christianity, and then Christianity took over
and,
the Roman Empire. That was the date they chose to